Um, James says, could you share an example of a major shift in your perspective on cricket based on something that you learned from exposure from cricket people from other countries' cultures? Ooh. Yeah, I mean, Australia it's not until you leave Australia that you realize how different cricket in Australia is to everywhere else. For good and bad, there's some really good things about Australian cricket. I think it really is played much more like a team sport than a lot of the other countries are. So I certainly think that is a positive in Australia's thing, but obviously it's also played in a, an aggressive, nonsense way at times. There's lots of good things and bad things, I suppose I would say. So getting out of that bubble was really interesting. I've talked about, there's an old podcast actually, James, which I did with Sabash about traveling to the 2003 World Cup. That really changed the way that I realized people thought about Australian cricket, and therefore changed the way that I thought about Australian cricket. But I think I was always a bit of an outsider anyway. I don't think there are that many kids in Australia in 1992 whose favorite cricketer was Mushtaq Ahmed. So I think partly I come from that. I'm trying to think of what else. Yeah, I think I realized that Australian tactics can be a little bit dogmatic. So I think talking to other people from other cricket places allows you to think a little bit more laterally than Australian cricket sometimes does, which it sort of sees something and goes for it, but it doesn't realize, like the two raptors in Jurassic Park, it doesn't realize you can come in from the side. I'm trying to think of anything else. But yeah, I think that 2003 World Cup was certainly a big thing. Hanging out with South African and Indian fans specifically really did teach me a lot about the way that Australia was seen, but also the way that people looked at cricket outside of that. But yeah, I'm not sure there's anything else. That's the main one. I think that really is the reason had I not made that trip, I'm not sure I would have developed into the kind of writer I am today. I think I would have been more of an Australian cricket writer rather than an Australian cricket writer who writes about global cricket. And when I look at Australian cricket writers, I still see them in that. They didn't have that early experience in the same way. That hasn't shaped them in the same way. Plus, the other big thing for me was because I didn't, my editors were Sambit Bal, Usman Samiuddin, David Hops. You can throw someone like John Norman in as the boss at TalkSport. These people do, when you're sending in copy and whatever, you're getting them notes back as a non-you person at any time when an editor. But specifically within cricket, I'm sending this off and Usman's like, well, that doesn't make sense because this happened. So, having those sorts of, they're all great at what they do. So having the ability to work for those sorts of people, and a lot of people are freelance for as well, I think really had that ability to change it. So I'd probably nail it down to those two. I'm not sure there's anything specifically, another major shift in I think by then I'd perhaps made the most of them. The only other thing that I had was probably realizing how I didn't realize kind of a couple of times when I've gone to work in cricket, it just looks more professional from the outside. And then when you're in it, you do realize it's not really that kind of place. So that's probably not about, other countries and other cultures. But then the only other thing I would say is that I think I've been in a really, really, I think people like me and Barra are really lucky to be able to really understand how different cricket cultures take up cricket. And because of the places we've worked for and the sort of journeys that we've had as writers, and because we've been feature writers, it really does allow us to understand that, cricket is consumed in a very different way in all these different places. And so I think that is probably another thing that I've come across.
Second
I don't know
part
if
if
I've
you'd
answered
like.
that question. So it goes back a long way with me. I think there was a lot of nonsense said about Australian cricket that was just clearly false sometimes by the written press, but more often by radio and TV. There's a really strong conversation I remember when someone said to Peter Roebuck, Adam Gilchrist is the best batter in the world. And I think this was 98 or 99. And Peter Roebuck's like, we've got Brian Lara, Steve Waugh, we've got, Sachin Tendulkar, Rahul Dravid, all these players who, had success over this period of time. This guy's been around for 5 minutes. And I really remember thinking, there's more to cricket. Also, you can take that back further to the fact that I love Pakistan cricket from a very early age, and they clearly had a big impact on me thinking about cricket outside of Australia. So those things were, I think, quite big. That 2003 World Cup thing that I talked about earlier with James was huge for me as well. But I honestly think that I like cricket more than I like Australian cricket. And I think it's almost as simple as that. And I love Australian cricket as well. It just happens to be that for whatever reason, from a very early age, I grew up in a cricket environment. And for me, cricket was the most important thing. And it wasn't Australian cricket at the same point. That doesn't mean I haven't gone to Australia. I went to that World Cup with a Australian flag cape on, and I had 7, 8, 9. Actually, I didn't have that many Australian shirts when I was young. I had mostly Victorian shirts. I'm probably not partisan when it comes to anything to do with the Victorian team. I'm much better with Victorian players these days than I used to be. But yeah, I do think that there's that. Also, I just think that there's probably just an outsider bias to me in general. And so, I see things in a slightly different way than perhaps a normal person would. I don't want to get too psychological there, but I'm sure there's that also plays a part.